Hay un campo de amor brotando desde los ríos.
Hay un barrio que canta en el Caimán del Caribe.
Las calles llenas de alegría, las estrellas se iluminan, apoyando el canto mío.
Hay un barrio que canta en el Caimán del
El
Caribe.
canto mío.
Hay un barrio que canta en el Caimán del Caribe. Hay un barrio que canta en el Caimán del Caribe.
¿Viste lo que te dije?
Hay un barrio que canta en el Caimán del Caribe. Hay un barrio que canta en el Caimán del Caribe. Hay un pueblo de sueños y abrazos compartidos. Y la que renace del esfuerzo de sus hijos. Hay una antilla grande de azul y blanco río. Hay un barrio que canta en el Caimán del Caribe.
Lo bueno, lo malo, el que trabaja, el arragán, los amigos, la maldad, la economía, la ineficiencia. ¡Cuba!
Welcome everybody to our webinar today, part of the Saving Lives campaign from Our Hearts to Cuba. We hope that that song brought you some Cuban joy. That's Un Barrio que Canta by Arnold Rodriguez and a collective of Cuban artists. Un Barrio que Canta means a neighborhood that sings. My name is Tamara Hansen, and I'm the coordinator of Vancouver Communities in Solidarity with Cuba. And I'm also an organizer with the U.S. Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition and organizer with the Saving Lives campaign. I'm also the author of 5 Decades of the Cuban Revolution, The Challenges of an Unwavering Leadership. My co-MC this evening is Cesar Sanchez, who is a co-chair of the National Network on Cuba. Cesar is also an organizer, webmaster, and designer for the International U.S. Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition and the U.S.'s New York, New Jersey Cuba Sí Coalition. At the beginning of every webinar, I'd like to acknowledge that our event is being broadcast from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in what is known as Vancouver, Canada. Because I think that it's important that as we come together to defend Cuba's right to self-determination, we also stand with Indigenous nations in unceded and occupied lands across North America and around the world to defend their rights to self-determination. Tonight, we've come together for this special webinar from Our Hearts to Cuba to talk about a special campaign that is happening right now in the US and Canada and also partly in Europe. And this is a campaign to fundraise in order to send pacemakers urgently needed in Cuba. And we're going to be discussing tonight why these pacemakers are urgently needed in Cuba, despite Cuba's world-renowned medical and healthcare system that is a free and public system. We're also campaigning to remove Cuba from the so-called state sponsors of terrorism list, where the US President Trump initially added Cuba to this list, but the Biden administration has refused to remove Cuba from this absurd list of so-called state sponsors of terrorism. And as people living in the United States, Canada, and again, around the world on this webinar, we have a real responsibility to campaign to have Cuba removed from this list. And we're going to be discussing why the situation in Cuba today is serious and is challenging, and why it is time for us to strengthen and be moved as a solidarity movement with Cuba. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening. And I now pass over the virtual microphone to my co-MC, Cesar Sanchez.
Saludos, mi gente. Can everybody hear me? I hope so.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, we have a great program tonight, and the theme for tonight's webinar is From Our Hearts to Cuba, special Saving Lives campaign webinar. Tonight's speakers will focus on fundraising campaign to send 300 urgent needed pacemakers to Cuba, as well as our campaign with us to remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism, which is known as the SSOT. We hope you all will get involved. Please sign up. Really get involved. This is very important. The general program for the webinar will be video greetings from the Cuban guest speakers, followed by Dr. Helen Yaffe, Bob Schwartz. We will then have time for Q&A, and we encourage you to post questions in the Q&A box on the Zoom, which will be on the bottom screen. You'll see a little icon Q&A. Just click on that and type in your questions, not on the actual chat itself, okay? So we also want to hear from you and encourage everyone to post in the chat, on Zoom, on Facebook, where you're joining us from us. Let's just keep that engagement going. We want people to get engaged. If you have any, express your feelings, ask questions, we really encourage that. We want to thank the Saving Lives campaign sponsors, the global health partners, the U.S. Cuban Normalization Conference Coalition, the National Network on Cuba, the Canadian Network on Cuba, and la tabla, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, la tabla de concertación de solidaridad Quebec, Cuba. We also have dozens of endorsing organizations, and of a group you work with would like to endorse the campaign. Please visit the Saving Lives campaign website, which will be posted in the chat. We also are live streaming on Facebook, so if you would like to share the video with Cuban friends, you could probably part of the criminal U.S. blockade on Cuba is the blocking of Zoom in Cuba as well. So, of course, sometimes our special days are able to find a workaround, the blockade to join us, but we share our webinars on Facebook so that more Cubans can learn about the solidarity movements in the U.S., Canada, Quebec, and internationally. So, our first video, which I'm going to be introducing, is from Dr. Alex Carreras Pons. He is the head of the bilateral issues on the international relations directorate at Cuba's Ministry of Public Health. We are honored to receive this video message from him. We had hoped to had a guest from Cuba's Ministry of Public Health would join us live, but of course, due to the complications of the U.S. blockade on Cuba, it was not possible. So if we could just start that video, that would be fantastic.
Hi, good evening. First of all, I want to thanks for the possibility to participate in this webinar and also for your support in this campaign to support Cuba with these pacemakers. To talk about the achievement of the national health system, previously we need to make a brief comparison of what we had at the beginning of the triumph of the revolution and what we have now. In 1959, we had almost 6,286 doctors. Most of them are located in the large city, the main capital of the province, and dedicated to private practice. And an exodus of the 50% of them occurred at the beginning of the years. It means that we had on that time only 3,000 doctors for a population of around 9 million of persons. The infant mortality was higher than 60 per 1,000 live births, life expectancy lower than 60 years, and the sanitary hygiene situation was mostly related with communicable diseases, many of them preventable with a vaccine program. Our illiterate population represented on that time the 40% of the population, and we had only one school of medicine for the whole island. At the end of last year, we can say that we have more than 94,000 of medical doctors. That represents around the 84.9 doctors per 10,000 inhabitants. We can cover with that the 100% of our country, even in rural and difficult access areas, we had at least one doctor and one nurse. Infant mortality was 7.1 per 1,000 live births. We need to highlight that previously to the pandemic, our infant mortality was during the previous 10 years between 4 and 5. Life expectancy is now 78 or 45, and in case of women, is around 80. Sanitary hygiene situation now is mostly related with non-communicable diseases, and we have one immunization program that covers 13 diseases with 11 vaccines. 8 of them are produced in Cuba by our biotech industry. According to the latest data published by UNESCO, our literacy rate is now 99.75%. And we have now 13 medical universities, 29 faculties of medicine, the Latin American School of Medicine, and the National School of Public Health. According to the principle of the national health system, we can say that is universal, it's free of charge at all levels. It means that from the entry level, that is primary health care, or if a patient needs a liver transplant or an implant of a pacemaker, for example, in one of our research institutes. It's available, provide a comprehensive care, and it has a strong international conception with community and intersectorial participation. According to the budget, we need to say that the government allocates to public health and social assistance the 27% of the state budget. If we add the 24% that is allocated for education, we can say that 50% of the budget is for health and education. That represents around the 11% of the GDP. Previously, I mentioned as one of the international achievement, and our international cooperation as a principle of the national health system, that it has more than 60 years. It started in 1963 in Algeria when we sent the first medical team, and currently we are in more than 54 countries, in 54 countries with more than 22,000 of health professionals. During this period, we have provided service in 165 countries with more than 605 health workers. A special mention needs the Henry Reef Medical Brigade that was created in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, and our Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro created that medical team specialized in natural disaster and serious epidemics. And from that time, 89 medical team has been sent to 55 countries with more than 13,000 of health workers. 3 of these brigades faced Ebola in Western Africa with more than 260 professionals. And during COVID time, we sent more than 5,000 of health workers in 58 medical teams to 42 different countries. These are some of the achievements of the national health system, but we have serious challenges in the national health system, such as the aging of the Cuban population. Now it's more than 20.3% of our population. It means that 20.3% of our population have more than 60 years old. Related also with diminished natality and fertility. Our fertility rate is around 1.2 per couple. The increase of non-communicable diseases like and antimicrobial resistance like worldwide. Climate change, and we are seriously affected as we are an island. Research and technological innovation. The high cost of new technologies and the economic financial blockade imposed unilaterally by the United States. Related with that, we can say that we have more than 60 years under an imposed economic, commercial, and financial blockade by the government of the United States. Only to mention one period from March 2022 to March 2023, the negative health impact is more than $239 million, and the accumulated impact is more than 3 billion in health sector. During Trump administration, 233 measures were imposed and remaining unchanged through the Biden administration, even apply with more efficiencies than even during Trump administration. Also, the inclusion of Cuba in the blacklist or the spurious list of countries that sponsor terrorists, limited access to credit, bank loans, to access to normal trade with most of the country, and unparalleled intensification of the economic and financial and commercial blockade has been applied since that measure was imposed. There is an international rejection, almost unanimous. Only mentioned the last year at the UN General Assembly, 187 countries support to lift the blockade. The blockade caused impossibility in acquiring medical technologies from the United States or even from different countries if that medical devices, for example, have more than 10% of a spare part of component from the United States. That forced us to search in this market, and sometimes through intermediaries, medicine, equipment, medical devices, region, raw material, for the manufacture of medicine and other supplies that we use in our medical care. That also increased the price for its acquisition and transportation from distant market. It has, of course, a major economic impact. Financial limitation, the increase of the pressure from the United States on international bank to limit our economic transaction, real difficulties for the sustainability of the national health system, because that incomes we need also to support that medical system that is free, but it has a high cost for sustain to the medical sector. It has a negative impact because there is a non-availability of necessary medication, lack of spare part for medical and non-medical equipment, and that have a very negative impact in health and quality of life indicator of the Cuban population as individual, in the family, and also in the community that they live. We need also to highlight the period of the pandemic, COVID-19, when we have no possibility of acquiring lung ventilators at the time of greatest demand during the COVID-19 pandemic. There was no possibility of acquiring medical oxygen or even a spare part from the United States to repair the oxygen production plant that we need to repair during that period of time. There was even no possibility of acquiring medical supplies or raw material, that is really necessary for the industrial scaling during the production of the Cuban vaccine against the SARS-CoV-2. What is the major impact, or what is the proposal with that blockade? As our president, Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez, he said that the purpose is economically suffocate the population, so that the population, due to economic suffocation, due to the discomfort that it causes, has a rupture that causes a social outbreak, and the final result will be the Revolution 4. And we need to say that that all of these limitations have a negative impact in the life of all Cuban citizens. Can you imagine how much we could do, and we can advance in the development of the country if we had been able to have resources during all this time? That's why we need to say that it's better without blockade.
Well, I should say thank you, Dr. Carrera, Dr. Alex Carrera Pons for actually sending that video. I think it's very important that, I just want to highlight a few things before we show the next video. And I think, as you mentioned, like the medical health system in Cuba is getting hard. I mean, it's hard to sustain it due to the blockade. As you mentioned, the ventilators was a problem, medical raw materials is a problem to get, and imagine, have the blockade has been lifted. I mean, you can imagine what they can do, but that's why we got to keep on pushing, to end this blockade against Cuba. The next video we got on right now is, I just want to make sure I got this right, is Dr. Dámaris Hernández Véliz, Deputy of the Director of Cuban Institute of Cardiology and Cardiovascular Surgery. So if you can kindly just pull up that video, please.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Dámaris Hernández Véliz. I appreciate of the members of this webinar your support for the health of my Cuban people. The Institute of Cardiology and Cardiovascular Surgery is a reference center for the cardiology in the country. It was founded in 1966, and since then the mission has been to promote and develop scientific research, technological innovation, and specialized medical assistance in the field of the cardiology and cardiovascular surgery, as well as the formation and improvement in the scientific professional potential necessary for development of the specialists linked in this area with objectives to raising health status of the population. It has 166 hospitalization beds and 4 critical care units. The Directorate in charge of medical care has 2 departments and 10 services. Within them is the arrhythmology and electrophysiology service. Is the reference to service in intracardial device implant in the country. Until 2019, 1,000 pacemakers were implanted annually in our institution, more than 60% of the whole country. Of the total number of pacemakers implanted annually, 64% are primal implants, and 67% are replacements. Of the total pacemaker used, 39% are single chambers, 54% are dual chambers, and 7% are triple chambers. Currently, less than half of these devices are implanted compared to previous years. In 2023, 3,005 devices were implanted, of which 52% were retrieved pacemakers. Single-chamber pacemakers are mainly used in elderly patients or young patients, children. Dual-chamber pacemakers in patients to this age, of which associated pathologies such as ischemic heart disease, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, congenital heart disease, etc. And finally, the switch-chamber pacemakers in patients with dilated cardiomyopathy and interventricular asynchrony. For example, the device of the Medtronic company implanted during Barack Obama's times as president, we can interrogate them with the only programmer that exists in our country, very deteriorated and with no possibility of replacement or repair the damaged parts, since there is no technical assistance. Also, the pacemakers implanted recently in the other countries and that company cannot be interrogated in Cuba. Therefore, there is a real problem in the access to the new technologies. And plus, there are currently 45 patients in our hospital pending device, 25 in intensive care unit service, 7 of them pending of cardiac defibrillators. And the longest stay patient has been in hospital since November 2023, pending cardiac defibrillators. In Cuba, there are currently more than 3,000 patients pending of this device. There is a direct effect of the attention of patients with cardiovascular disease due to the economic and financial embargo of the United States. In Cuba, we not said embargo, we said blockade, which does not guarantee the necessary financing to acquire the supplies and or necessary device that could be obtained in the other countries, not necessarily in the United States. The detection of procedures related to cardiac arrhythmias due to the use of American parts and components are the deficit of pacemakers with estimated effect of 3,075 patients to whom the device could not implant it. Thank you for your attention. Okay.
So we have to say a big, big thank you to the doctor for her excellent video. That was Dr. Dámaris Hernández Véliz. And we thank her so much for sharing those words with us about her work and her speciality. We are now going to go to our first live speaker. I'm so excited to have with us the wonderful Helen Yaffe. Dr. Helen Yaffe is joining us very early in the morning for her from Glasgow. She is a senior lecturer in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow. Since 1995, she has spent time living and researching in Cuba and participating in solidarity campaigns. Helen has co-produced 2 documentaries, Cuba and COVID-19, Public Health, Science, and Solidarity, and Cuba's Life Task, Combating Climate Change. She is also the author of Youth Activism and Solidarity, The Nonstop Picket Against Apartheid, as well as another book, We Are Cuba, How the Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World. And finally, Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution. And actually, I know that Helen has also just done a new documentary that wasn't in that introduction. It's so new, I didn't even add it, but maybe she'll mention that today in her talk. So I'm going to hand over the virtual microphone to Helen Yaffe. Helen, you're muted.
Sorry.
No worries.
I should know how to do Zoom by now. I'm going to start by seeing if I can share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. Can you see it big screen? I need to go to the start. Okay, so this is me. That's my email if anyone wants to write to me. I'm going to start out by talking about the US economic sanctions on Cuba. Trade, finance, everything, what the objectives are. Now, I know that I'm not telling most of you anything new, but we go back to Lester Mallory's memorandum of April 1960, where the US is concerned about the revolutionary state in Cuba and acknowledges that it has popular support, and says that the only foreseeable way of alienating internal support is through disenchantment, disaffection, based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. How will they achieve that? Well, every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba, denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. And that has created the sort of objective for US policy since that point. So let's bear that in mind when we hear Biden and all the previous presidents that Cuba has outseen, the Cuban Revolution has outseen, expressing their concern for the human rights of Cubans. Of course, the US blockade is the biggest violation of Cuban human rights. So the blockade, we talk about the blockade, and I'll deal with this question of embargo or blockade, which the previous video touched on. But what we need to understand is it's not just one piece of legislation. It is a very complex, overlapping set of series of laws and legislation. And I've just mapped them out here So the first piece of legislation is actually a law from 1917 to do with from the First World War, Trading with the Enemy Act. And then we have laws that are introduced specifically for Cuba from 1961, 1963, 1979, 1982, 1996, 1999, and 2000. So we see how many of these were introduced during Cuba's economic crisis and political isolation after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, when Cuba had to, decided to hold on to socialism, but also had to reintegrate into a global international capitalist market, and all the effort that was made to stop Cuba being able to do that. 2017 to 2020, Trump introduces 243 new actions, sanctions, and coercive measures, including more than 50 of them during the COVID-19 pandemic, when international organizations like the UN were calling on countries to drop sanctions, which affected the capacity of countries to deal with the pandemic. Biden has added sanctions of his own. Okay, embargo or blockade. So an embargo is when one nation establishes a policy not to trade with another nation and not to allow its own territory to be used for commerce with that nation. It's a prerogative of any nation. It's about bilateral trade. But a blockade historically is when a country uses a military threat or force to close the borders of another entity to international commerce, preventing normal commercial activity with third parties, in this case, Cuba and the rest of the world. A blockade is an act of war. Now, although there is not a naval ship circling Cuba, the cumulative effect of US sanctions on Cuba effectively block Cuba's commerce with other states, their citizens and companies. So we can be sure that the United States imposes a blockade on Cuba. This is a really important point because a lot of the response from people who oppose Cuba, are critical of Cuba, and we've had some in the chat today say, what's the problem? Cuba doesn't have to trade with the US, so what? It can trade with the rest of the world. And I'll explain a little bit about why that's so difficult for Cuba. So the US blockade is what we call extraterritorial. It's US legislation, but it impacts other countries. It goes outside its own jurisdiction. And this actually started in 1961 with the Foreign Assistance Act, which said that any country that assisted Cuba could not get assistance from the United States. In 1992, the Torricelli Act prohibited foreign-based subsidies of US companies in third countries from trading with Cuba or Cuban nationals. It banned foreign ships docking in Cuba from entering US ports for 6 months. It denied foreign assistance and debt relief to countries aiding Cuba. This was increased with the Helms-Burton Act of 1996, which threatened entities and individuals in third countries with legal action and the denial of entry into the US for anyone trafficking, as they put it, in nationalized properties. There are multiple other regulations. For example, one was mentioned: third country manufacturers cannot export to Cuba any goods containing more than 10% of their components being from the US or US subsidy. So this is a complex web of overlapping legislation that's almost impossible to navigate. It obstructs trade and investment. Now, obviously, Britain and the EU and Canada are their own sovereign and imperialist interests, and they have rejected the extraterritorial application of the US blockade. They, in fact, threatened clawback legislation and legal action. But of course, as Lenin described the imperialist countries, I think, as a band of hostile brothers, they made a deal. They came to an agreement in 1997. The US said, we will limit the impact of provisions in the Helms-Burton Act. We won't apply Title III, which allows them to take people to, allows US citizens to take foreigners to US courts, with total violation of international law. And we won't apply Title IV, which is the denial of visa, to everyone. So they made a deal, and in response, the EU stopped its legal action, and they adopted what was called the common position. It was a political position of hostility towards Cuba. However, this gradually disintegrated, and in 2016, the EU and Cuba signed a political dialogue and cooperation agreement, and much more interaction started, including funding for food programs, sustainable development and agriculture, and so on. But in 2019, under the Trump administration, the United States lifted Title III. This is the legislation that they'd agreed to suspend. It was actually signed. The president of the United States every 6 months signed a suspension for all of those years. What did Britain, the EU do, and Canada? Well, they threatened legal action, but effectively they did nothing. And so Title III has had a major impact. What exactly is it that scares European banks? Well, if we go back even to the Obama era, and Obama, there is an impression that Obama was responsible for improving relations with Cuba. Yes, there was normalization. No, sorry, there was not normalization. Yes, there was rapprochement. They opened embassies. But let's not forget that under Obama, the Office of Foreign Asset Controls, that's the US Treasury, issued 56 fines on foreign entities engaging with Cuba. These were worth about 14.3 billion, and 2.8 billion worth of fines were issued even after rapprochement was announced. So European banks have been fined for transaction with Cuba, massive multi-million and even multi-billion dollar fines. So if we want to understand how the US blockade works extraterritorially, it is also that fear factor. Banks are risk averse. The risk of fines means that they list Cuba among their sanctioned countries. That means they block payments, and that prevents trade in goods and services, remittances and donations. If you cannot make those transactions, how can you get goods into the country? How can Cuba export and provide the services that it does? The US, of course, also applies political pressure on governments, warnings, advice that they shouldn't go ahead with certain deals or exchanges with Cuba. And this has been targeted to interrupt Cuba's capacity to provide medical assistance around the world. There are multiple examples. It's something that many people have discussed. I've written articles on it as well. So in 2021, a few days before leaving office, very punitively, Trump returned Cuba to the state sponsors of terrorism list. So Obama had not that long before taken Cuba off that list. What this meant is that Cuba automatically qualifies as high risk for international banks, for businesses and investors, and any institutions, in fact. Within a few weeks of that nomination, over 30 financial institutions left Cuba. So those are banks and financial institutions, but then of course that affects the businesses and institutions that are trying to exchange with Cuba, work within Cuba, because they cannot carry out those transactions. So Cuba is listed as a sanctioned country, by banks, even in countries where the law says it's illegal. So for example, in the UK, in Britain, in European Union, it is actually illegal to apply US laws, in this case, the sanctions against Cuba, against citizens and entities in those countries. And yet banks go ahead and do it anyway. And so this is something that is effectively illegal, and several campaigns have been set up throughout Europe to challenge this extraterritorial imposition of the US blockade. There's Unblock Cuba, there's 1 Cent for Cuba, which Tamara has been involved in, as have I. And the idea is to change the risk assessment of the banks to make it more expensive for them to illegally implement the US blockade of Cuba by carrying out transactions. What this campaign has done is prove the extent to which the US blockade is extraterritorial. I'll give an example. If I try to send a £1 transaction from a UK bank account to a European bank account, it will be blocked. So, you know, if that's what's happening to me, and I'm not even talking about sending money to Cuba, it just gives us an insight to how difficult it must be for Cuba to carry out transactions with the rest of the world. Okay, so Cuba was included on the state sponsors of terrorism list. There's been a lot of focus about the importance of getting Cuba off that list. What's so bad about the list? Let's be clear. There are now globally very few international banks that will transact with Cuba. You can count them on one hand. Banks are by nature risk adverse, and we can say the same for businesses, investors, and diverse institutions. So even the academic institution where I am is extremely hesitant to do any cooperative agreements with Cuba. Cuba's inclusion on the list is totally unjustified and extremely punitive. And I think that point has even been made by officials within the State Department. They are almost speechless when they try to justify or explain why Cuba is included. I think many of you will have seen the Belly of the Beast video where Liz Hernández is challenging the spokesperson to explain why Cuba is on the list, and the response is sort of incoherent. Another result of the inclusion of Cuba on the SSOT list is that there is a secondary ruling that says that any citizens who are from one of the countries that can normally get a visa waiver for entering the US are automatically excluded from that system. It's called the ESTA visa waiver system if they have visited Cuba. So this has affected, you know, people who are visiting Cuba for a beach holiday. It has affected business people. It's affected academics, scientists, researchers. Obviously, when people find out that there is this additional cost to them for visiting Cuba, they're put off from visiting. So it obstructs tourism, it obstructs other visits, the scientific ones, the academic ones, and so on. One very recent example is that the football team from the Cayman pulled out of a match with Cuba just a few days ago for a World Cup qualifier because many of their players have traveled to Cuba or traveled to the US and study in the US, and they couldn't risk jeopardizing their ability to enter the US with the ESTA visa waiver. So of course that impacts revenue for Cuba, and that goes back to Lester Mallory's memorandum and the objective of sanctions to impact Cuba's economy, to create hunger, desperation, and, as they wish, overthrow of government. If the United States blockade in all its complicated web of legislation was eliminated, but Cuba remained on the state sponsor of terrorism list, very little would change for Cuba in terms of its ability to interact with the world. And that's why the demand to remove Cuba is so essential. Let me be clear here that even humanitarian aid is blocked from entering Cuba. So, you know, the State Department comes out with announcements. It did after the Matanzas fire, for example, saying, oh no, we permit humanitarian aid. But when a group of people, for example, Cubans in the UK, tried to raise money to send material aid to Cuba after the fire, to send medical aid after the fire, the crowdfunding websites close that down, confiscate the money, or send it back to donators, you know, citing this the fear of fines and risks, and that Cuba is a sanctioned country. So when they wrote to the State Department and, you know, challenged them, how can you say that humanitarian aid is legal, and at the same time we're not able to collect money in the UK, which is not under US jurisdiction. They're told, oh well, you know, companies will make their own decisions, they're totally entitled to do that, but they don't address the fact that those decisions are based on US legislation. So there are multiple examples of efforts to get syringes to Cuba, other kinds of material aid, even pianos for music schools have been blocked because as a secondary impact of the US legislation. Okay, what can we do? Well, in the US, activists need to keep mobilizing to demand an end of the US blockade and to demand Cuba is removed from the state sponsors of terrorism list. And we should have an approach that says no more slow or incremental steps. What is needed now is a big irreversible change. Outside of the United States, we need to continue to challenge the illegal extraterritorial imposition of US sanctions. We need to hold our legal and government system, governments to account, right, to actually implement the laws of our own countries. We need to let people know that the US blockade negatively affects them, and not just Cubans. It affects them because when we outside of Cuba cannot get access to Cuban COVID-19 vaccines or Cuba's lung cancer immunotherapy or Cuba's diabetes treatment for diabetic foot ulcers, then we're all impacted. We need to contribute to material aid. We need to contribute to this pacemaker campaign and any other donations. This is a way of actively breaking the blockade. What's more, as the first video, this first speaker was saying in the first video, Cuba has shown incredible solidarity around the world, with people around the world, and I've written on this, and the figures are really quite astonishing. The number of people globally who've benefited from direct assistance from Cuban medics is phenomenal, and the percentage of Cuba's GDP that it spends on development aid, and particularly medical aid, is far exceeds even the wealthiest countries. So Cuba has shown incredible solidarity with the world, and it is now time for us to return that solidarity with Cuba. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Helen. I think that was very profound, very insightful information. I mean, I love the fact that you actually spoke about the blockade, the laws, the regulation, the complexity, the overlapping seriousness of these sanctions on Cuba. Reminding people that the 240 sanctions that set from Trump, and how Biden continues with these sanctions. And I like the fact that you actually, you break down and stuff the definition, between the embargo and blockade, from the Foreign Assistance Act, the Tourism Act, the Helms-Burton Act, the bank sanctions, such as the transaction that's being blocked, obstruction of tourism, all this due to the SSOT. So thank you so much, Helen, for what you give us all this insightful information. Our next speakers I'm going to bring up right now, and before I introduce them, I just want to make sure I got all my notes in front of me. Yes, it's okay, just bear with me. I think I lost my notes here. Oops, sorry. Okay. Sorry, Bob. Okay, so the next speaker is Bob Schwartz, the Executive Director of Global Health Partners. He has more than 35 years of experience building support for Central American economics and social development programs, primarily in the area of public health. He is also an advisory board member of ACERE, Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect. Bob has done some tremendous work to get the crucial campaign to send these pacemakers to Cuba off the ground. So again, let's welcome Bob. And Bob, I'm so sorry for the delay. That's technology. Sometimes things just gets lost in the mix.
Well, Thanks, Cesar, and thanks, Tamara, for hosting this webinar. I want to thank the Cuban Ministry of Health for participating tonight. It's difficult for them to connect live, and I know a lot of them are watching tonight in Havana. And a big thank you to Helen Yaffe for staying up with us this evening. It's now going on 2 a.m. in Glasgow, and for her support for the Pacemaker campaign. In early January, I called Helen to commiserate about how the blockade and the current economic crisis has been punishing Cuba's healthcare system. And we discussed for the first time the shortage of pacemakers in Cuba. Well, we came up with a game plan, and now here we are 5 months later, and I'm proud to report that our first donation of pacemakers arrived in Cuba just this week. The Pacemaker campaign is a unique effort. It's also an unprecedented undertaking. In my 30 years of providing solidarity and humanitarian medical assistance to Cuba, we've never attempted something so challenging and yet potentially so rewarding. In some ways, it reminds me of the imperative for the syringe campaign several years ago, insofar as it addresses a critical need with life and death implications. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with the Saving Lives campaign or the syringe campaign, the Saving Lives Coalition, which is comprised of dozens of individuals and organizations that are working against the blockade, we came together during the first days of the pandemic. And the syringe campaign, which was initiated by Saving Lives, is likely the single most important humanitarian assistance program that we've ever collectively attempted to support Cuba. We delivered 6 million syringes at a time when syringes were almost impossible to source. If folks remember, every city, every state, every country was looking for the exact same syringe. Now, although Cuba had 2 COVID vaccines that are as effective as the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccines, they didn't have a sufficient number of syringes. So our efforts, we raised roughly $640,000. We saved countless lives in Cuba. We helped them to vaccinate their entire population, and we helped to reopen the country. Now, like the syringe campaign, we began the Pacemaker campaign with relatively modest goals. In this instance, we planned to raise $150,000 and to send 300 pacemakers to Cuba for patients with severe cardiac disease. And for the first time, we're coordinating this effort collaboratively with Europe, Global Health Partners, which is the organization I work with, and Medicuba Europa, which is the leading European solidarity organization that provides medical assistance to Cuba. We've come together to lead this campaign, raising funds in the United States, Canada, and I think in 9 European countries. Now, Cuba has a 3-year backlog of patients that need pacemakers. And currently they have 80 patients hospitalized and tethered to external pacemakers. And as you might imagine, you don't last very long on a pacemaker waiting list. As you've heard, due to the sanctions in large part, Cuba's been unable to purchase pacemakers in the international market. Due to Cuba's inclusion on the terrorist list, manufacturers simply don't want to sell pacemakers to Cuba. And even when they do, Cuba's unable to access the global banking system in order to pay for them, as Helen outlined a little earlier. Now, there's also a tremendous consolidation within the cardiac pacemaker industry. A small number of companies dominate the market. 3 of the largest companies, Medtronic, Abbott, and Boston Scientific, are based in the United States. The other 2 are from China and Germany, and with the exception of the Chinese pacemakers, which I really can't speak to, all of them use U.S. manufactured components, which means they require a license from the United States government in order to sell to Cuba. And none of them are willing to sell to Cuba. So Global Health Partners applied for a license permitting us to purchase and donate pacemakers to Cuba. And after months of discussion with pacemaker manufacturers, we have a leading cardiac company that's selling to us. We've already purchased, along with the Europeans, 130 pacemakers, and we have orders for 100 additional units. Now, there's another important component to the Saving Lives campaign, and we're mentioning it here, and that is removing Cuba from the terrorist list. One of the most punishing acts of the Trump presidency, and there were many, was President Trump's designation of Cuba as a terrorist state. And it's the SSOT designation that prevents them from normal financial transactions. When we talk about Cuban migration, and more than 500,000 Cubans have left the country over the last 3 years due to the serious economic crisis. It's the SSOT designations that helping to fuel those hardships. And when we point to the tremendous difficulties that humanitarian organizations have providing Cuba with essential medicines, medical supplies, and even food, which are increasingly difficult to buy and ship in international markets, it's that terrorist designation that makes all of these efforts so challenging. You recall that candidate Biden promised to roll back the most egregious Trump Cuba policies 3 years ago. Well, today we're still waiting for President Biden to keep his word. Biden's current policy, which is sadly a continuation of President Trump's, is costing immeasurably hard pain, suffering, and even death. And removing Cuba from the terrorist list can be done by executive order. So there's a toolkit and links on the NNOC and Saving Lives websites where you can let the White House and the State Department know that you want Cuba removed from the SSOT list. And I'd urge everyone to click on those links when this webinar is over. I think they'll be posted by the organizers. I think I'm going to pause at this point, but I also want to ask everyone on this call to think long and hard about what they can do to help support this life-saving effort. It's rare when each of us have an opportunity to save somebody's life. And this is not one of these feel-good emotional appeals that you most likely find every day in your inbox. I've gotten dozens today alone. $500 will save someone's life. Let me repeat that. $500 will save somebody's life. So for those of you who've already contributed to this remarkable effort, you have my deepest thanks. If you haven't, I urge you to kind of step up tonight or in the next couple of days. Truth be told, everyone in the United States has access to pacemakers, should they ever need one. It's covered by insurance, including Medicare. Many of you on this call may have a family member, a friend that has a pacemaker. But to be told you need a pacemaker and that there's a 3-year waiting list, no patient, no family, no doctor should ever be in that position. So I'm asking everyone here to lend a hand and to contribute what you can to support this remarkable project. I was told a couple of minutes ago that 2 members of the Saving Lives campaign have contributed $1,000 each this evening. If anyone else can match those gifts, please let us know in the chat function or email me. Contributions are tax deductible, and you can make them online at ghpartners.org. Now, earlier, I told you that we had a modest goal of raising $150,000 and sending 300 pacemakers. Well, as of today, collectively with Europe, we've already raised $157,000, and we have pledges for at least 20,000 more. The first pacemakers arrived in Cuba on Tuesday this week, and we're discussing scaling this campaign and sending as many as 400 or 500 pacemakers. Cuba needs roughly 2,000 pacemakers to take care of all the patients on their waiting list. So please do what you can. No matter how much you gift, you'll be helping to save a life. At the same time, you're standing up to oppose a blockade that's killing just as surely as bullets and bombs. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks so much for listening, and hopefully we can open this up to questions and answer. Cesar?
Oh, no, thank you, Bob. You know, I mean, fantastic. I mean, you do such great work, Bob. I mean, when I look at you and the stuff you do, and then listen to Helen's speech, is so inspiring. And I hope that everybody that's watching or listening to this, please get involved, you know, go to the donate button. I mean, it's all in the chat. I mean, everything's being posted there. Please, if you can't do it, you can always just share it with your friends, email out to everybody. Again, let's just try to get people more engaged. We do have some Q&A here, but I just wanted, I mean, if you guys could, you have access to the Q&A, Helen and Bob?
We're just gonna make a few announcements before we head into Q&A.
So we do it after the announcement? Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So I do see we have excellent news from David Paul in the chat that he is ready to donate $1,000. We have a commitment from Vicky Legion to pitch in $400. And so people asking also about how they can contribute from Canada. I believe the website will work with a Canadian MasterCard. If folks want to publish what they're planning to donate in the chat, that would be fantastic. We can total up how much we raised tonight in the webinar and add that to the great total that Bob just told us about. Again, every $500 is another pacemaker. So that's fantastic. We have news from Kevin Voon. It says it does work in Canada. I just donated $100. So thank you so much, Kevin. We have Karen Hollis saying sending $100. Thank you. And I have Nino Paglicia saying I would like to contribute $500. Aaron Feely Naham will match Vicky's donation with $400 US. So thank you so much to everybody who's posting in the chat. I've got Moon Luna Vasquez contributing $100, and we'll come back to that as we go. So thank you so much, everybody. This is fantastic news. Lenny Villagomez will match Vicky and Aaron with $400. Thank you so much, everyone. This is fantastic show of solidarity to get these pacemakers to Cuba. I'll ask that probably John Waller, who said he'd be monitoring the chat, kind of take down the pledges, and people can go direct to the website and make those donations. And we're really looking forward to some great Q&A with Helen and Bob. We've got about half an hour before Helen needs to sign off because she committed until 2:30 a.m., but not beyond that, and we can't do that to poor Helen. So
Right. That's right.
thank you so much to everyone who's donating. I will read out more pledges when we come back from some questions. We've got more people making pledges in the chat, and I do want to recognize all of them here tonight. So let's go to our very first question. I see, let's see here. We have a question in the chat. Oh, I was hoping, Helen, if you have one that you think that you would like to specifically answer, but I'll go and ask the first question I have here. Cuba is the real force for good and has the reputation and evidence to back it up, unlike Canada and much of the EU member states and NATO. Cuba being on the state-sponsored of terrorism list seems contradictory. What nations and what groups is the U.S. claiming makes Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism? So either Bob or Helen can probably answer this. What is the Trump accusation against Cuba for adding the justification for adding Cuba to this list?
Okay, shall I go?
Yes, please.
I mean, one of the accusations is to do with the fact that there are members of the Colombian guerrilla organizations in Cuba. Why were they there? Cuba was leading a mediation to achieve a peace treaty between the government and the guerrilla organizations. And actually, there were other countries involved, European countries. I believe, was it Norway that was involved in that? And interestingly, Norway was not added to the state sponsors of terrorism list for that reason. The interesting, this was totally undermined, this pretext was totally undermined when the Pedro government came in Colombia and said, this is unacceptable and you can't, in Colombia's name, accuse Cuba of sponsoring terrorism when they are actually playing an international mediary role, which has led to peace agreements. So the government of Colombia has completely condemned this and demanded that that this pretext is removed for Cuba's inclusion onto the State Sponsors of Terrorism Act. Other cases are people who have sought asylum in Cuba, but they're there as under criminal charges. It's not related to terrorism. So I mean, it's all dubious, and State Department officials have come out and said, there is no justification. This is just politics and it's punitive. So, I mean, we should be clear. I mean, there is a bigger issue, right? Who is the United States to determine who the good countries are and not? But even if you cut into the details, it's absolutely flimsy and unjustified. I don't know if maybe Tamara, you want to add to that, or anyone else?
I'll open that to Bob, but I think that was a great answer. I think it really, the White House, I think most recently when they were asked directly by Liz Fernandez from the belly of the beast, basically listed off human rights abuses, quote unquote, in Cuba, nothing about terrorism. And then said, I'll have to get back to you on that, basically. So
it was cringeworthy, wasn't it? I mean, it was absolutely, you almost felt embarrassed for the spokesperson because he's trying to justify something that's not logical and not justifiable.
That's right.
I think Helen nailed it. The two issues that they bring up is the FARC when they were in Cuba for the peace accords, and Americans who were living in Cuba. Let's be clear, there are no terrorists from the United States living in Cuba. Cuba is not giving sanctuary to any terrorist. So, there's terrorists living openly in France. There's terrorists living in Saudi Arabia. They're not on the terrorist list.
But also, we should say that there are anti-Cuban terrorists who have lived at complete liberty in the United States. So
Correct.
Luis Posada Carriles, who effectively admitted to a US journalist that he was involved in the terrorist bombing of hotels in 1997 and other campaigns. Orlando Bosch, Jorge Mascanosa, who was involved in financing terrorist organizations. And these people lived and died at liberty in the United States.
Yeah, that's right. And I will also would like to add too, like all terrorist organizations like the Omega 7s and the Alpha 66, that has been funded by these individuals. And in fact, one of the documentaries from Belly of the Beast actually just does point out that directly, and the ties, like U.S. politicians, elected officials has ties to that in the 70s and early 80s. So, that's absolutely right. So now we're talking about terrorism, okay, I mean, the double standards and say, Cuba, there is no evidence whatsoever, and they still haven't come up with any shred of evidence. Why? Because there isn't any terrorists in Cuba. Plain and simple.
Thanks, Cesar. So I've got a bit of a longer question here. But I'm going to read it for you. And Helen, if you want to reread it, it is in the Q&A box, and it's from Yuri Smuter, our friend joining us from Europe. Also, so thank you, Yuri. It says, hello, thank you for this online event. All the informative information and the much needed truth-telling, myth-busting you do. I wanted to ask, how should one who does believe in Cuba solidarity and détente and not doing regime change, how do we overcome the Cuban expat community who tend to vote Republican or very right-wing Democrats who want to continue the embargo and not only overthrow the government, but repeal all major gains of the revolution? If the person is an exile who might have legitimate grievances towards the two Castro administrations and the current leadership, assuming they aren't lying or engaged in half-truths, how do we address their grievances and convince them that this economic terrorism and what the US and their allies have in mind for Cuba is not in the interest of them and their families, especially if they might be left leaning and can be converted into leftism, not right-wing circles or liberal circles they most likely associate with?
Okay, so you want me to respond to that? I mean, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Cuban exiles, Cuban, you know, refugees, asylum seekers, as they are often self-nominate, are the only group of exiles I'm aware of that frequently return to the country where they claim they are persecuted for medical treatment and for holidays with their families. Now, I don't want to, you know, generalize, but that is absolutely a documented feature. So we, you know, need to be clear. And I think this point that when they, for whatever reason that they've left, when they call for a blockade, which, as I said, is the greatest violation of Cuban human rights, they are directly targeting their own families and communities and neighborhoods that they left behind. So I think that we shouldn't be afraid to engage in a dialogue directly and to challenge the accusations that are being made. I think often when we do that, we find that they're very flimsy. I mean, I was speaking at an event about Cuban medical internationalism, and a Cuban came in and he started saying, oh, you know, I was a Cuban medical internationalist and I was, you know, and we're like slaves and we're forced to go and forced to travel. And I said, look, you know, I know something about Cuba. I've lived in Cuba. I've studied Cuba. You're saying this with that awareness. You, if you went on an internationalist mission, you signed a voluntary contract. And the other issue is, you know, who paid for your training to become a medic? And so this was at an event with US medical students. And so we just paused and asked them how much had they had to pay for their medical training. You know, and it's just, for me as a British citizen, it's astonishing. They do pay, we do pay in Britain for our university education and qualifications, but nothing like the levels that are charged in the United States. And then we asked him, how much did you pay for your medical education, your highly skilled qualification? And, you know, the answer was he paid nothing. So, you know, I think that just not being Cuban doesn't mean that we don't have the right to discuss, debate, and challenge some of those views and actually try to get to the root of what motivates them.
Thank you so much, Helen. Sorry, I'm reading the chat while I'm thanking you. Bob, did you want to add anything to that? No, okay. So I do want to just make some more announcements about donations in the chat. We have a $500 pledge from Lewis Wolf. We have $100 from Mark Kuhner. We have Sayero, who's pledged $50 on the first day of July. Thank you so much. Barbara Nimri will contribute $500. Rita Baruch, $1,000 in memory of Betty Baruch, an RN. Christy Brainhan will pledge $200. We've got Joe Callahan, who's going to pledge another $500. We have David, I'm sorry to mispronounce your last name, David Schweckart, who will contribute $1,000. On behalf of my organization, Vancouver Communities in Solidarity with Cuba, we've pledged $200. We have people who are pledging to make announcements on radio stations like WBAI in New York, as well as others who are pledging to reach out to friends. Marcy Shapiro has donated $500. And we have post here that so far with those pledges, we are at $7,550 for tonight. And John Waller is encouraging us to try and make it to $10,000. So please keep posting your pledges in the chat. Again, nothing is too small, $20, $10. Of course, nothing is also too large, but you know, don't feel, you know, we are all working people, and we understand that sometimes the budget is tight. And so anything that you're able to contribute, we appreciate, but please, you know, don't go outside of your means, but don't think that it's unimportant just because others are contributing more. It all matters, and it's all going to go towards a great campaign. We have Sean O'Donoghue in the chat from La Table de Concertation de Solidarité Québec-Cuba. He said that they're working on this campaign in Quebec as well. And also they have collected some medical supplies, but they're having a challenge of how to ship it to Cuba because of the blockade and Cuba's inclusion on the SSOT list. Looking for any advice for folks there. Carol Francis Lincolns has donated $100. Asa Rojeby has pledged $150 from Friends of Cuba Against the U.S. Blockade, Vancouver. And so we so much appreciate all of the work. Trevor Hoover has donated $100. All of that is so much appreciated in the chat, and keep it up. I'll come back and make more announcements as we go. And I wanted to go to our next question. We're wondering about generally the campaign to remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. What are some actions that folks can take? I know we've been posting in the chat a bit about toolkits and other things. What are some of the, you know, the actions that people can concretely take right now to raise this issue, both in the United States and internationally?
Well, I'll jump in here. The single most important thing to do is to reach the White House and State Department. We're not going to see this resolved in the next year or two by congressional legislation. But if you remember, the 243 Trump sanctions were all put on by executive authority, and they could be removed by the president just as easily. It literally can be done with the stroke of a pen. He informs the Congress, there's no debate, and he can remove Cuba from SSOT. That's probably the single most important thing to do. Now, there's we're playing offense, we're also playing defense. There's an act in the House that passed called the Force Act, which would codify the SSOT, making it all the more difficult to ever remove it from US law. That's now been bounced to the Senate. And I believe Joaquin Castro this evening announced that he's going to oppose that in the Senate. So if folks want to also put pressure on the Senate, write your senators and tell them you want Cuba removed from the SSOT. Those are the two things that I would recommend as easy fixes. We have links. The NNOC has links. The SEDE has links. Cesar, I believe Saving Lives may have links as well.
Yes,
but it's easy to do. So when we're done with this call, if you've made your donation, click on the links and write the White House.
Thanks, Bob. Helen, did you want to address that?
I mean, it's US legislation, right? So I just, that slogan, I think, agitate, organize, and mobilize. Don't just get angry, get active. And, it's for people in the United States to determine how that happens. But, we do our bit in outside of Cuba and challenging the illegal extraterritorial application of the US blockade. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you the challenges that I face just as an academic trying to do research and collaborations in Cuba. Everything is complicated. So yeah, we just, wherever you are, there is a contribution that you can make.
Thanks, Helen.
Thanks,
Yeah, I
Helen.
mean, I think what also maybe is good to highlight for folks also, and maybe this will, Bob and Helen, make you think of some things as well, is the fact that Cuba's focused on getting itself removed from the state sponsors of terrorism as a very urgent demand. And that, you know, for many years we've been campaigning against the U.S. blockade on Cuba. This has been going on for over 60 years, and it is criminal and cruel, and we have an obligation to end the blockade. But we were asked very directly by Cuban representatives in Canada, in the United States, to really focus on the state sponsors of terrorism list as something that was imposed by Trump, and as something that could be, again, as Bob mentioned, kind of signed away quite easily. And I think that we have to make that distinction for folks as well, that both of these campaigns are still ongoing. Both of them are important, but that, you know, Cuba is really pushing for the SSOT for all the things that you mentioned in your talk today, Helen, about how it is really creating real challenges for purchasing things on the international market.
Can I just say something as well? I mean, something that a lot of us know, but we haven't said. It is actually insulting to Cuba to accuse it of being a state sponsor of terrorism, because Cuba is the country in modern history that has been the victim of the most state-sponsored terrorism from the United States. So many years ago now, I think probably 15 years ago, maybe more, I'm getting old, the Cubans produced a document that detailed every single case of terrorism and sabotage that had been launched from the United States, or including by Cuban exiles in the United States, with or without direct support from the US establishment in its various institutional forms. And that tracked or had a record of well over 3,000 Cubans, civilians, who had been killed as a result of this terrorism, and another over 2,000 who had been permanently maimed by terrorism. So, you know, the fact that Cuba has faced state-sponsored terrorism and then gets put on this list, I mean, I can imagine for Cubans it's an utter insult. And we need to remind people, you know, where someone posted something in the chat, right? Where are the state sponsors of terrorism? You know, I teach on Latin American history. If any of you don't know the history of Operation Condor, then you need to look it up. This is, you know, the United States supporting the right-wing military regimes in the 70s, which were responsible for arresting, detaining, torturing, and disappearing literally hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds and thousands of civilians in Latin America. And we see, you know, their movements, the grandmothers of the Plaza in Argentina and in Chile, and these crimes are not accounted for. But what we know is that the US was conscious, it was providing intelligence, helping to coordinate. So who are the state sponsors of terrorism?
That's right.
Cesar, did you want to ask the next question? I posted it to you in the Zoom chat.
Okay, just want to make sure.
I think this will be our last question,
Yes,
as
this
we have
from,
committed to letting Helen go.
I
Okay.
can carry on for a bit. I mean, it's generating a lot of money for the campaign, and I've already wrecked my night's sleep. So, and you know,
Okay.
we're in, where I am in Glasgow, it gets light at about 4 o'clock. So I've got an hour and a half.
Tamara, is this the one from Yuri again?
No, it says, thank you for the fantastic speakers. I put it in the Zoom chat. It's from Janine Solanki.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you to the fantastic speakers and organizers for hosting this event. I think the speakers have provided a lot of important information on how the blockade impacts Cuba. But can speakers also talk about the negative impacts that the blockade on Cuba has on people in the United States and other countries, especially with Cuba's medical internationalism? Can you ask this question from Janine? I guess that's it. Janine, yes.
I'll jump
Bob,
in.
do you want to start? Do you want to? Yeah.
Sure, sure. You know, there's a lot the United States can learn from Cuba, and there's a lot that we can obtain through collaborations and through Cuban medicine. I'll give you a great example. There's a Cuban drug that treats diabetic foot ulcers. Many of us on this call are familiar with it. It's called Hebeprot P. It's 83% effective in the treatment of diabetic foot ulcers. In the United States, upwards of 60,000 Americans every year have amputations as a result of diabetic foot ulcers, most of them African American. And that drug was not permitted into the United States until several months ago, where it's running through FDA tests. Could you imagine what a boom it would be if we can treat patients with Cuban medicine as opposed to amputation? That's one example. There's medicines that are being created for Alzheimer's disease, for muscular dystrophy, for cardio diseases, and we have no access to it. Cuba would love to have collaborations with American biotech companies, American pharmaceutical companies, with universities. One example, my organization has brought down roughly 36 surgical teams to train Cuban doctors in advanced surgical techniques, pediatric urology, pediatric maxillofacial, hip and knee replacement, one of the easier. All of those exchanges have been stopped by SSOT. A lot of people don't know universities are not covered by liability insurance because Cuba is on the terrorist list. So those are just some examples of what a more normal bilateral relationship could look like in the medical sphere. It's certainly not the entire issue. Helen, do you want to jump in? I know you've got a lot of examples.
Well, I mean, you know, the same examples really that you've said, the lung cancer vaccine, and just general scientific exchanges, cultural exchanges. I mean, Cuba is incredibly rich in terms of its culture and arts. It has more art instructors than anywhere in the world, as well as more doctors per person than anywhere in the world. And you know, I think that, yeah, it's worth pointing out that we all lose out. I mean, not just in the US, because as I've explained, it affects all of us. I mean, I'm really struggling to get my university to jump through the hoops necessary for me to do collaborations. And I'm interested in Cuba's quite exceptional approach to climate change adaptation. And that has really, you know, life-changing or implications for other small island developing states, SIDS, but and obviously Cuba's regional neighbors in the Caribbean. But I think globally in the global South, what Cuba is doing is cutting edge as it is in biotechnology. Cuba is the only country in the world to have a long-term state plan to confront climate change. And the plan puts at the center the welfare of the population and the environment, as well as, you know, the economic issues that it faces. So we all have so much to learn from Cuba. But the establishment is quite terrified, quite frankly, if you say, well, look, we can look at this small Caribbean socialist island that was colonized for 400 years and have managed to, you know, establish a model of sustainable development which is exemplary. I mean, many scientific reports have identified Cuba as the only country in the world achieving sustainable development, or among the leading countries in the world achieving sustainable development. And that means that it's living within the capacity of its ecosystem to recover and reproduce itself, whilst also raising the standard of living. If you look at what Cuba spends per capita, per person on healthcare, and you compare it to the United States and you compare it to Britain and other countries in Europe, it's a fraction. And yet they have comparable results. So someone, an opposition person wrote in the chat about the deterioration of Cuban hospitals. I mean, I've experienced Cuban hospitals from the inside. And yeah, the infrastructure is underdeveloped, but we know why that is. That's because the United States blockade stops them getting the resources, even construction material. And yet, they still have more doctors per person than anywhere in the world, but incredible results in terms of infant mortality. If we want to see how the US blockade is killing people now in Cuba, we can look at infant mortality, because Cuba got to the point where it was under 4 per 1,000 live births. That was way ahead of the United States. And we should also say that in the United States, you have an average figure, which is, I don't know, 7 point something. But if you looked at the disparity between wealthy citizens and poor ones and immigrants and indigenous people, then it would be, much greater. But Cuba achieved infant mortality below 4. And that has now risen. It's risen to over 7 for a few years, partly because of COVID, but it's been, they haven't been able to bring it down because of this economic crisis. And this is an important point that I wanted to say. For many years, it was difficult for people to prove that, Cubans talked about the US blockade being genocidal. And it was difficult to demonstrate that because the Cubans have a socialist system. So while it impacted their development and their overall national wealth, they were distributing their scarce resources equally, or in a way that prioritized the welfare of the population. And I've had conversations where people ask me, how can we prove that this is, that the blockade kills people? But that changed with the Trump sanctions of 2019 and then COVID, because then we saw directly, as the first video said, Cuba could not get medical ventilators for its COVID-19 patients. Why? Because it had a supplier it had 2 suppliers from Switzerland, and they were bought out by a US company. Not only did they refuse then to sell the medical ventilators to Cuba, but they refused to sell spare parts for the ones they already had. Likewise with their medical oxygen. And people in Cuba died. And when Bob first approached me and to talk to me about this campaign, it was clear this is another example where the US blockade is directly causing the death of Cubans. So, when there were sanctions on Iraq, it was calculated, I think the UN calculated, right, the number of people who died as a direct result of sanctions. And it was horrific. It was 150 children every day. And then we look at Cuba and we say, well, it's not having that impact. But that is because the Cubans, because they have a socialist state. And even with their socialist state, and they've retained, there's been reforms and openings to the market and so on, but they've retained the key tenets of the socialist state, particularly the welfare element. And yet the blockade of Cuba is really starting to make people lose their lives, but also to deteriorate their quality of life. Because as they were saying, imagine waiting 3 years for a pacemaker. So yeah, that's all I'll add.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was really an excellent answer. Bob, did you had answered that, I guess, already? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. All right, I'm gonna tally up some more donations that we've received for the Saving Lives campaign and the Pacemakers in the chat. And I'll just give Helen and Bob a moment to think about any wrap-up comments. Also, Cesar, if you have any wrap-up comments that you want to make.
Well, no, I mean, I see a couple of questions on the chat. In terms of like mailing the check, I don't have the address of that, but I think it was already added in the chat. However, if you want, you could go to ghpartners.org/Cuba 2024. It's in the chat. If you click on the link, it should give you the address and the donate button. And of course, going back to flyers, brochures, letters, there is a toolkit for the Saving Lives campaign. You go to savinglives.us-cubanormalization.org. If that's too much, you go to the nnoc.org. Very nice and simple. So again, all the information is there. You could donate. There's a toolkit there. You can endorse the campaign. If you haven't endorsed, I encourage people to endorse it. You can endorse it individually or as an organization. So please, reach out to, I'm reaching out to everyone. And so far, I think I just, there you go. Thank you so much from Allison Bodine, my dear sister from Canada, as always. Global Health Partners, 39 Broadway Suite, 1540, New York, 10006, I believe. Yes. Oh, no. Okay.
I think there was an important point made in the chat that people contributing should not use the word Cuba in their transactions and their check, because I mean, this is how ridiculous it's got. It's not just the country that's being blockaded, it's the word, right? So there is, a system which picks out the letters CUBA, and any transaction with those letters is frozen.
That's right.
I believe that Cuba Junior Gooding has had a problem.
If you want to mark something in the memo, Pacemaker campaign or Pacemakers, that's sufficient.
Yes.
Maybe I'll wrap up with just a couple.
Well, can I just go through the donations and then we'll come back to Bob and Helen. So Mark Friedman pledged $250. Thank you to Mark. Nancy Yamada, $100 today, more in July and August. Thank you so much. John retallied us. We were at 8,250. We also had a pledge from Bob Blair for $20. Thank you so much, Bob. Julie Walensky for $100. Thank you, Julie. Again, the address has been posted in the chat. Diane Stradling pledges another 150 and also says that she sent 200 recently. So thank you so much, Diane. We also have lots of love in the chat for our speakers tonight. So thank you very much, everybody, for all of that support. John Waller updated the total to $8,520. Then we're going to keep going. There's 32 new messages in the chat. People are sharing where they're writing in from, sharing how you can call the president to tell him to get Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. Pick up that phone tomorrow and let Biden know what you think. So we thank so much all the great donations that have been pledged in the chat. I'm just going to make sure that we have more greetings from and solidarity from Fire This Time Movement for Social Justice. We pledged $200. Viva Cuba. And we have other people who are committing to go back to different organizations they're part of and get folks involved in the campaign, which is exactly what we want. We need more people raising awareness about this campaign. The financial appeal for tonight is now at $8,720. And there was also, it seems, a private donation made, and so we're now at $8,720. So
that's fantastic. Wow.
Yes. So many people have made great contributions. We appreciate you so much. This is really beyond our expectations for tonight. So we so much appreciate. People have also raised donations that have been made previously to let people know about other organizations that are supporting. So thank you so much, everybody. $8,720 tonight on this webinar. So much appreciated. Again, all the donations from, the $10 to the $1,000, everything is going to go towards a very important cause. So we're going to get ready to wrap up. I do just want to invite folks to another webinar that is coming up very soon. And that is a webinar organized by the 1 Cent for Cuba campaign, which Helen Yaffe mentioned. This webinar is called Let Cuba Speak, End the Media War on Cuba, and will feature Keith Bullender, Milagros Acea, Andoni Iturribe, and Jose Manzaneda. And this is in solidarity with some attacks that have happened on Cuba Información and Euskadi Cuba, two organizations based in Spain. One is a news network and the other is a Cuba Solidarity organization. We're going to be talking about how mainstream media is leading a war on Cuba and how those who are speaking up in favor of Cuba are under attack. So that's going to be happening Sunday, July 7th. And I will post the information in the chat how you can register for that. But you can also go to tinyurl.com/infocuba to register now for that webinar. So we encourage everyone to come out. And again, that's being organized by the 1 Cent for Cuba campaign out of Europe. And then also for anyone who is beaming in from Canada, I also have to remind you that we do have a new petition out in solidarity with Cuba. It is a parliamentary petition. My computer's having a hard time here. There is a new parliamentary petition to the government of Canada demanding that the government of Canada put pressure on the U.S. government to remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. So if you're joining this meeting from your computer and you have your phone handy, you can scan this QR code now. Again, it is only for residents and citizens of Canada to sign this petition. But again, please pass on the message to anyone that you know in Canada. The full information is in the chat also to learn more about that campaign. All right, so I'll hand it over to Bob and then Helen to wrap us up for the evening.
All right, well, I'm going to be very short. I feel guilty that Helen's still on and it's now, what, 2:45 in Glasgow. A quick comment about the Pacemaker campaign, and we've done several campaigns over the years, somewhat similar. This is not an answer to Cuba's pacemaker crisis. Let's be clear about that. The idea is to be able to get them a little breathing room to take care of as many patients on their waiting list as we possibly can. But the answer is exactly the way Helen constructed her presentation tonight, removing Cuba from the terrorist list. Until Cuba can go out and have normal relations with other countries and with other banking institutions and with other vendors, they're not going to be able to resolve the pacemaker situation or many of the crises in Cuba's public health system. Frankly, I've been working in Cuba now since the special period. I began in 1994, and I don't believe I've ever seen conditions as bad as they are today. The shortages and the scarcities are staggering. Essential medicines, disposables, medical supplies, surgical supplies. If you walk into a hospital, maybe a 50-50 chance that you get ibuprofen today. Now you can buy those at a private store, but could you get them in a Cuban public hospital or a clinic? It's iffy. We're not going to resolve that until we get rid of SSOT. So this campaign was always designed as humanitarian and advocacy. And I'd urge everybody, I've always felt very comfortable and very secure in what we could do collectively to address the humanitarian issue. I knew from the beginning, if we worked in partnerships, that we would be able to deliver on the 300 pacemakers. 100% convinced about that. It's the advocacy work that I'm most concerned about. And that's where we've really all got to pick up the ball, up our game a bit. And Helen, I think you nailed it in terms of what people need to do when we get off this call. So I'm gonna stop there. Thanks, Cesar. Thanks, Tamara. Thanks, Helen. And thanks to everybody here for their support. It's overwhelming. I did not expect to be able to raise this kind of money on a webinar like this. And just be assured that every dollar is going to be put to good use. So Helen, it's your mic.
So $80 to go, guys, to reach 10,000, unless that's my bad maths. I am starting to see double from exhaustion.
Yes,
No,
I
my
think
final words. I basically, I want to start by thanking Bob for actually launching this initiative. And I was pleased that I could get involved at the outset. And obviously, it's great to have that transatlantic solidarity link with Cuba Europa. We do need to work together. We're up against incredibly powerful forces. But, you know, we need to, as I said, mobilize, agitate, organize, and make ourselves a nuisance, really. So, you know, in answer to the question, what should we do? Whatever works for achieving that. I'm amazed by how much has been donated. It's absolutely fantastic. And, you know, let's think of it in terms of how many pacemakers is that? So 10,000 is 20 pacemakers. And that's fab. That's 20 people who, you know, who will have a future like beyond what they could have expected being on a 3-year waiting list. So fantastic. Thank you so much to Tamara and Cesar and everyone else who's been involved. There's always other people who you don't see on the panel who are involved in organizing the event. And although I'm exhausted, it's always fun to come and participate with you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
Helen.
much. Yeah, and thank you to Cesar for being my co-chair this evening. And also I want to give a big thank you to Aaron Feely-Nahum for posting all of these things in the chat. Thank you so much to Azza Rojby and to Allison Bodine for their work on tech. Thank you very much to John Waller for keeping the tally going of how many donations we have. And
I got my maths completely wrong. Sorry.
yes.
I do economics. It's just I'm tired.
That's right. No worries. Math and economics are not the same thing. We all know that. Anyways, thank you so much to everybody for being here with us this evening. Viva Cuba, abajo el bloqueo. Cesar, you want to sign us out?
Well, I just want to say thank you all for attending to this webinar. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Bob. Thank everybody behind the scenes running the show, helping us put this webinar together. Thank you all. And remember, Viva Cuba, bajo el bloqueo, and just keep on struggling, my brothers and sisters. Ciao.
Out,
Viva Cuba, abajo el bloqueo.
out with the
Viva
blockade.
Cuba.